Welcome to the Golden Gems podcast. Today, we're taking a deep dive into Joshua Adam Schulte, the brilliantly volatile CIA engineer who leaked to the agency's entire cyber arsenal in Vault 7 and received 40 years in prison.
Right.
And looking at the sources we've stacked up today, they outline this incredible, profound paradox at the heart of the modern intelligence apparatus.
Yeah, the paradigm is completely shifted.
Exactly. I mean, the most lethal weapons a government possesses aren't physical spies operating in the shadows of foreign capitals anymore.
No, they're lines of code.
Lines of code, written by engineers sitting in windowless rooms in Northern Virginia. We are talking about coders who are actively building an invisible digital panopticon that surrounds all of us.
Right. And the mission of our deep dive today is to really unpack the arguments of these texts regarding how the most brilliant among those very engineers became the structural flaw that brought that entire edifice crashing down.
All right, so let's get into it. Because the primary narrative anchor, we're analyzing posits Schulte not just as a standard intelligence employee, but as a foundational architect of that digital panopticon.
He was. And by tracking his trajectory, the sources argue he was the inevitable result of a system that demanded total technical dominance, while simultaneously treating its human architects like disposable components.
Like cogs in a machine.
Exactly. He essentially became the ghost in the machine. He decided that if he couldn't command the respect of his peers, he possessed the technical capability to command the attention of the entire globe.
So let's look at his origin story because it fundamentally departs from the typical profile of the coastal elites who historically populate the upper echelons of the intelligence community.
Right.
He was born in Lubbock, Texas in 1988. He is very much a product of the American heartland.
And the texts point to that geographical and cultural foundation as really critical to understanding his psychology. Growing up in that Texas landscape, he was steeped in a culture of individualism.
Deep conservatism, too.
Yeah, deep conservatism and a native skepticism of federal overreach.
Which is fascinating for someone who goes to work for the CIA.
It is. And when you synthesize those genealogical foundations, those values of liberty and a built-in resistance to authority with a truly generational intellect, you get a very specific, volatile psychological profile.
He was fundamentally wired to resist being treated as a mere cog.
Right.
And his technical skills, they were undeniable from the very start. The source materials detail his time at the University of Texas at Austin as a computer engineering prodigy.
They describe someone who didn't just learn to code. He natively understood system architecture on a molecular level.
Which completely explains why his first foray into intelligence, his brief stint at the National Security Agency in early 2010, just didn't last.
It was from January to May 2010.
Right, a few months. He found the NSA entirely too slow and bureaucratic for a mind that moved at his pace.
So by May 2010, at just 21 years old, he transfers directly to the CIA.
He officially graduates in 2011, entering a government workforce that the texts note is aggressively pivoting toward asymmetric cyber warfare.
And he enters the absolute sanctum. While officially placed in the Directorate of Science and Technology, his real operational home is a classified facility in Northern Virginia.
Physically separated from the main Langley headquarters.
Exactly. This is the Center for Cyber Intelligence, specifically the Operations Support Branch, or OSB.
The OSB.
Yeah, the documents describe this as the holy of holies for government hackers. Their mandate was absolute and terrifying.
To build the tools required to hack anything, anywhere, at any time.
And Schulte thrived in that crucible. He was writing code capable of bypassing the world's most advanced encryption protocols.
Because of this technical ascendancy, they grant him the highest level of security clearance and administrative access to a network called DevLan.
Right, and for context for you listening, the sources explain that DevLan is an air-gapped development network.
Meaning it is physically disconnected from the internet to prevent outside intrusion.
Exactly. And it held the source code for every single cyber weapon the CIA possessed.
At 21 years old.
At 21, he literally held the keys to the kingdom.
The sheer concentration of power granted to someone that young is staggering. He is engineering backdoors into supposedly secure operating systems used by millions of people globally.
But the tension highlighted in the primary essay arises because, while his technical capabilities are virtually godlike within the confines of that network, his interpersonal reality within the office is entirely fractured.
Which brings us to a major turning point in the analysis. When you look at the classic traitor archetype in American history, you think of Aldrich Ames selling out human assets for cash,
Right.
or Edward Snowden downloading files based on a grand constitutional ideology.
But Schulte subverts that archetype completely.
Completely. According to the forensic timeline in our sources, the catalyst for the largest intelligence breach in CIA history was remarkably banal.
It was a petty feud over a desk in a rubber band war.
It sounds absurd on its face.
It does. But it exposes the toxic reality of the operations support branch. The texts describe an environment that was less a room full of stoic professional spies and more akin to a frat house.
You had a confined space filled with brilliant, socially maladjusted young men.
Spending their days engineering global weapons of mass digital destruction, and their downtime shooting Nerf guns, drinking, and relentlessly hazing one another.
And within that hyper-competitive environment, Schulte's reputation was intense. His colleagues literally nicknamed him Voldemort.
And the nuclear auction.
Right. The files indicate these weren't affectionate monikers. They were warnings.
He was known to be volatile and incredibly arrogant, but simultaneously too competent to fire.
Which is a dangerous combination.
Highly dangerous.
Yeah.
And this dynamic eventually boils over into a petty feud with a coworker involving foam darts, rubber bands, and escalating insults.
And management fails to intervene effectively. They just view him as a brilliant problem child. So their administrative solution to this escalating feud is to simply move Schulte's desk.
And to understand why that matters, we have to look at the psychological analysis provided in the materials.
Right.
To a man like Schulte, whose entire sense of self-worth was intrinsically tied to his towering intellect and his elite status within that specific unit, moving his desk wasn't a minor logistical change.
No.
It was an intolerable slight. It was a public humiliation that shattered his ego.
So he responds by drafting a deeply revealing email to management. It's essentially a manifesto of petty grievances titled, "Regarding the Desk Situation."
Yeah.
But beneath the complaints about cliques and office politics, he even questions if he's being punished because he's bald. The essay argues it's a scream of profound alienation.
It marks the realization that his unparalleled technical brilliance couldn't protect him from the social dynamics at a high school cafeteria.
And that moment of alienation is when the CIA makes its fatal error.
Management decides to discipline him further by stripping his administrative privileges to the DevLan network. They take away his official digital keys.
But they vastly underestimated the architect of their own system.
The forensic audits later revealed they didn't realize he had already built unauthorized backdoors into their network and forged secret keys for a digital ghost identity.
So in 2016, facing ongoing disciplinary action and a forced transfer out of the unit, he decides to burn the house down.
He doesn't just steal a handful of files. Utilizing those forged secret keys, he copied the entire OSB repository.
Source code, user manuals, operational mission notes. He took the absolute crown jewels of American cyber espionage.
He loaded the CIA's entire digital arsenal into his pocket and walked out the door.
And the scale of what happened next permanently altered the landscape of global security. The body of work he took eventually made its way to WikiLeaks.
Right, which began publishing it in March 2017 under the codename Vault 7.
We are talking about 8,761 individual documents and files. To this day, the sources confirm it remains the largest data breach in the history of the Central Intelligence Agency.
And this wasn't a leak of diplomatic cables or policy memos. This was the release of a fully weaponized digital arsenal.
Let's get into the forensic breakdown of these weapons from the supplemental notes, because it reveals the terrifying ingenuity of the OSB.
Consider a program called Weeping Angel.
Yes.
Developed in conjunction with British intelligence, this malware specifically targeted Samsung smart televisions. It forced the television into a fake-off mode.
Think about the smart TV sitting in your living room right now. You hit the power button on the remote, the screen goes black, the LED light turns off, and you assume the device is dormant.
But Weeping Angel meant the microphone was still active.
Recording the audio in your room and transmitting it directly back to CIA servers. They successfully turned a mundane living room appliance into a sophisticated surveillance node.
And beyond domestic surveillance, the geopolitical implications of the tools were massive. The leak detailed the Marble framework.
This one is wild.
It is. This was an obfuscation tool designed purely for false flag operations. It would deliberately insert text strings in Russian, Chinese, or Farsi into the CIA's custom malware.
So if a foreign government or a cybersecurity firm discovered the attack, the digital fingerprints would point toward a foreign adversary. rather than Langley.
Effectively sowing international confusion and potentially triggering diplomatic crises.
Then there was Grasshopper, a highly modular malware platform engineered for Windows operating systems.
The technical specs show it was designed to invisibly bypass top-tier antivirus software from companies like Kaspersky and Symantec.
And its persistence was the most alarming feature. It would remain embedded on a target machine even if the user completely wiped and reinstalled the operating system.
But perhaps the most controversial element exposed by Vault 7 was the agency's hoarding of zero-day exploits for Apple iOS and Google Android.
Right, and for those following along, a zero-day is an unknown vulnerability in a piece of software that the original vendor doesn't yet know about, meaning there is 0 days of protection against it.
Instead of alerting Apple or Google so they could patch these critical flaws and protect billions of global users, the CIA kept them secret to maintain their own spying capabilities.
The sources argue this proved the intelligence community actively prioritized their surveillance power over the fundamental security of the global telecommunications infrastructure.
The public exposure of Vault 7 was an absolute catastrophe for the agency. It was an act of asymmetric warfare committed by a single insider that instantly neutralized their global cyber capabilities.
Operations worldwide had to be aborted immediately.
They effectively handed their most advanced classified source code to foreign adversaries, who could now reverse engineer the tools, build defenses against them, and worst of all, repurpose them to attack the United States.
Which leads us to the tragedy and the substance of the criticism surrounding his arrest. The government's response to a breach of this magnitude introduces the most legally and ethically complex aspect of the case presented in our materials.
The FBI launches an unprecedented manhunt and raids Schulte's apartment in New York City.
But they do not immediately file espionage charges.
Right. The authors of our sources highlight a highly controversial government tactic. They arrest him based on a server found in his apartment containing thousands of child pornography images.
Now, we need to report on the arguments presented here impartially. Schulte's defense claimed the server was simply an open file-sharing hub he maintained for dozens of friends, and that the incriminating material was not his.
Analytically speaking, the texts focus heavily on how the government deployed this collateral charge.
It is a known federal strategy in complex national security investigations to use an immediate, unrelated charge to securely detain a suspect while building the much more difficult classified espionage case.
And the impact of that specific tactical choice by the Department of Justice went far beyond keeping him behind bars.
It comprehensively destroyed his character in the public eye before the espionage trial ever commenced.
It entirely stripped him of the moral high ground that whistleblowers typically try to claim. He could no longer be viewed as a defender of civil liberties or privacy.
The government was able to effectively paint him as a monster, isolating him from potential public sympathy.
And the carceral reality he faced following that arrest was extraordinarily severe. He was sent to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York and placed under special administrative measures.
Commonly known as SAMs.
Right. For context, these are the absolute most restrictive confinement conditions permitted by U.S. law, usually reserved for cartel bosses or high-level terrorists.
He was locked in solitary confinement 24 hours a day, entirely denied contact with the outside world.
The lights in his cell were never turned off, and he was subjected to constant, deliberate noise.
The texts include his own writings, where he explicitly equated these conditions to physical and psychological torture, comparing the federal facility to a concentration camp.
It details the extreme psychological disintegration he was undergoing.
Yet, despite that immense toll, the sources document how he waged a relentless information war from inside his concrete cell.
He managed to smuggle a contraband cell phone into the highest security wing of the facility.
Which is incredible.
He used encrypted email accounts to communicate covertly with journalists, drafted tweets, and actively tried to leak even more classified information about the CIA's task forces.
He absolutely refused to be silenced by the machine, and when the espionage case finally went to trial, he chose to represent himself.
The transcripts from those trials outline a bizarre legal spectacle.
Truly.
You have a man facing decades in federal prison, delivering opening and closing arguments that vacillated wildly between brilliant technical analysis and highly erratic grievances.
He personally cross-examined his own former CIA colleagues, the same men he used to shoot foam darts at,
forcing them to admit on the stand how flawed their security protocols were.
He relentlessly attacked the government's forensic evidence, arguing that the CIA's DevLan network was so inherently insecure that any number of contractors or foreign hackers could have stolen the data.
He framed himself purely as a convenient scapegoat for the agency's own staggering incompetence.
And incredibly, that chaotic strategy initially worked.
In 2020, the Department of Justice suffered a stunning defeat with a hung jury and a mistrial.
A single engineer, representing himself against the full weight, unlimited resources, and fury of the federal government, managed to convince a portion of the jury that there was reasonable doubt.
The DOJ naturally refused to let it go, retrying him in 2022. During the second trial, they tightened their forensic presentation and secured a conviction on all counts.
Which brings us to the philosophical stakes of this entire saga, culminating on February 1st, 2024, when Joshua Schulte was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison.
While the sentence is technically a composite of the espionage and the collateral convictions, the underlying message broadcast by the state is unmistakable.
The message is, you are a component. You are the property of the national security apparatus. If you break the machine will break you.
The sentence is explicitly designed to ensure he never touches a networked computer again, serving as a chilling, permanent warning to every other brilliant engineer working in the intelligence community.
So what is the legacy of Vault 7 for the rest of us? The sources outline a deeply paradoxical aftermath.
On one hand, Schulte undeniably made the world far less safe by releasing incredibly dangerous cyber weapons into the wild,
placing them in the hands of foreign states and independent hacking syndicates.
But on the other hand, the leak forced a massive shift in global cybersecurity.
Because those vulnerabilities were exposed, tech giants like Apple, Google, and Samsung were forced to immediately patch their systems and harden our consumer electronics against state weaponization.
We only know our televisions can watch us and our phones can betray us because he laid the architecture bare.
The leak forced an uncomfortable global cultural conversation about the ethics of asymmetric cyber warfare and the danger of governments hoarding zero-day vulnerabilities.
But synthesizing the primary arguments from these texts, the ultimate vulnerability exposed wasn't in the software. It was the human element.
Yeah.
The CIA learned a hard, structural lesson. You cannot demand the services of a generational genius, place him in a toxic environment, treat him like a disposable janitor, and expect your most devastating secrets to remain secure.
The system fundamentally relied on flawed, emotional human beings to build its digital cages.
Exactly.
Looking at the rigorous analysis in these documents, they leave us with a deeply debated question to consider. According to the government, Joshua Schulte was given 40 years strictly because he posed an apocalyptic threat to national security.
But the critical essays we're reading present an alternative argument for you to weigh. That he was utterly destroyed by the state because he held up a mirror to the CIA's own internal dysfunction, arrogance, and toxicity.
As the text suggests, the agency simply couldn't bear the sight of its own reflection.
It perfectly encapsulates the profound tension of the modern era, the collision between state power, the demand for total transparency, and the immense human cost of the digital transition.
He built the panopticon, decided to dismantle it, and ultimately let the rubble fall squarely on top of himself. Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to mull over as we close out this deep dive. As artificial intelligence and cyber warfare become increasingly autonomous, rapidly removing the human hand from the trigger, consider this. The final fail-safe standing between total state surveillance and your personal liberty might not be a law or a constitution. It might just be the fragile, unpredictable ego of a single, disgruntled engineer. Thank you for listening to the Golden Gems podcast. We'll be back next time with another deep dive. Until then, keep exploring, keep listening, and keep celebrating the power of uncompromising voices.